How you guys doing this morning? Good? Well, I am pumped to be hanging out with you. My name's Abby. I'm our Next Steps pastor here, and I especially want to say welcome to everyone joining us today at our West Wilmington location and online. Guys, will you help me show them some love? We are excited to have you this morning, and I really am so honored to be hanging out with you. Grateful to Pastor Mark for this opportunity. He is such an incredible visionary leader. He helped lead our church through a global pandemic, and then he preached a killer message last weekend to kick off this series called Worth It. And so we're talking about what it looks like to love God with everything we have, all of our hearts, all of our mind, all of our soul, all of our strength. And maybe you're gathering with us today and you're not quite sure what you believe about this whole God thing, much less loving God with everything that you have. And I want you to know that's okay. Our church really was designed for people just like you who are just checking us out, who maybe aren't quite sure what they believe yet. But I really think that today what we're going to talk about is something that we can all relate to, no matter who we are, no matter where we're at in our faith, and that is doing the thing we don't want to do. How many of you have been in that situation where you know the right thing to do, but you just find yourself doing the complete opposite of that? Let me see your hands. All right. Okay, so I am not alone. I know that happens to me pretty frequently. I'll never forget a few years ago, it was more than a few years ago. I'm older than I like to admit. So about 13 years ago, I remember it was my senior year of high school. It was Christmas time, and I was getting ready to go off to college in a few months. And so I was convinced I needed the two things that every college girl in America had. Number one, a black North Face jacket. And number two, the only, a pair of Ugg boots. So I spent weeks and weeks heading into Christmas asking my parents for those two things. And here's the thing with Uggs. They are actually not functional at all for walking across a college campus. They're not waterproof. They have no traction. They would always kind of give me blisters on the back of my feet, but I did not care because I wanted to look good, all right? I was here for fashion, not function. And some of you guys out there are rolling your eyes, but listen, Tom Brady made Ugg boots cool for you too, all right? So this was 2007. Everyone wanted a pair. So Christmas morning rolls around. We start opening gifts. I open my black North Face jacket, and I'm like, here we go. It's going to be a good Christmas, right? We are 1 for 2. And so we keep opening gifts. We keep opening gifts. We keep opening gifts, and you know exactly where this is going. We get to the end, and there are no Ugg boots. So in that moment, I had a choice to make. I knew the person that I wanted to be. I wanted to look at my parents. I wanted to say, thank you so much. I'm so glad I got this jacket. I'm so grateful for you. But I was not that person because I was 17 and I was a selfish brat. So the person that I actually was in that moment is I got up silently from the room. I don't even think we were done opening all of our family Christmas gifts. And I went to my mom's laptop and I opened it and I started searching online to where I could buy Uggs. And my mom walks in and she's like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, since you won't buy me the thing that I wanted for Christmas, I guess I'll just do it myself. Oh, right, yes. It makes me cringe just thinking about it. And I actually know my mom is watching this weekend. So, Mom, I would like to publicly apologize to you for being such a selfish brat when I was 17 years old. And on behalf of teenagers everywhere, parents, we're sorry. All right, we can't always control. We are doing the things that we don't want to do. And you've probably been in a time like that where you have found yourself doing something that you didn't want to do. Maybe this happened to you during quarantine. I feel like the new thing in 2020 was we've got this time, we're going to plant a garden, right? Some of you are like, yes, I was going to plant a garden. I was going to eat fresh produce. But then you find yourself on the couch with a bag of chips and some salsa, and you're like, it's corn and tomatoes, so it's basically the same thing, and you're not doing what you want to do. Maybe for students, you had a time a couple months ago where you're like, yes, I'm going to get online, I'm going to go to my Zoom classes, I'm going to do that history assignment, but then TikTok, and then you weren't the person that you wanted to be. Maybe this has happened to you as a spouse or a parent. I know I've had those moments where I say, hey, I want to be more intentional with my kids. I want to be more intentional with my spouse, but then the pressures of work and life just start to seem overwhelming, and all of a sudden we are doing the things that we don't want to do. And we've all been there. Actually, a guy in the Bible named Paul writes about this very struggle. And Paul was not always what you would consider a good guy. I think sometimes when we think about the Bible, we assume it's filled with good people. I mean, God put them in the Bible. God entrusted them to write part of the Bible, but that was not Paul's story. In fact, he originally was going around killing Christians. He was persecuting people who had put their faith in Jesus. So he was pretty far from a good guy. But then he had this transformative moment with God, and he put his faith in Jesus. And after that, he not only put his faith in Jesus, he started traveling around, spreading the message of Jesus, planting churches, leading people, loving people, pastoring people. But even despite that transformation, we're going to read here that he struggled with this very thing. Even after being transformed by the power of Jesus, he still struggled with doing what he didn't want to do. And so here's what we read. This is Romans 7. He says this, "I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right." Thank you, Mom and Dad. I'm grateful for the gifts that you got me, but I don't do it. The Ugg boots, right? Like this is, here he has this struggle. He says, "Instead, I do what I hate." Absolutely. We've all been there. That's why we want to do one thing, but we find ourselves doing another. So the big question is, why do we do it? Well, and here is how Paul starts to answer. He says, "So I am not the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is my sinful nature. I want to do what's right, but I can't do it." He says, "I want to do what's good, but I don't. I don't want to do what's wrong, but I do it anyways." We get the point, Paul. He says, "But if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it." So anybody ever have a time where you did something wrong, but then you were grateful you had someone else to blame? This is why siblings exist, all right? You do something wrong and you can blame it on your brother or your sister. I've got 2 little kids. My oldest isn't even 4 years old yet, and he has already perfected the art of blaming his brother for things that his brother could not possibly do. But I think that's because within all of us, we don't want to own up to the stuff that we've done wrong. We like having somebody else to shift the blame towards, and Paul does that here. He says, hey, he basically tells us we may not be responsible for our bad behavior, but it's this thing called sin that's living inside of us. And now I know this sin thing can make us uncomfortable. That's not something we want to talk about. Who wants to talk about the things in their life that they've done wrong or that they feel guilty about or ashamed about? No one. That's not what we want to focus on, but the truth is that if we want to start understanding who God is, how much he loves us, we've got to start with understanding this sin thing, what it is, how it affects us. And sin, in its simplest form, is just missing the mark. It's anything at all that we think, say, or do that falls short of God's glorious standard, of his perfection for our lives. And so last week, as we kicked off this series, we talked about how we love God with all of our heart. And next week, we're going to talk about how to love God with all of our strength. But this week, we're focused on those middle two. How we love God with all of our soul and all of our mind. And it's interesting because when we read the Gospel of Mark, this account of Jesus' life where he's telling a group of people how to love God with everything that they have, with all their heart, all their mind, all their soul, all their strength, there's a religious teacher in the audience. And as soon as Jesus finishes talking, this religious teacher responds to Jesus. And here's what he says. He says that this teacher replied, "Well said, teacher. You've spoken the truth by saying that there is only one God and no other. And we know it's important to love him with all my heart, all my understanding, and all my strength." So did you notice? Jesus says, love God with all of your soul, all of your mind. And this religious teacher replies saying, loving God with all of our understanding. If we want to love God with all of our understanding, we have to start with this sin thing, the thing nobody wants to talk about. We've got to understand what it is, where it comes from, how it affects us if we ever want to move past it. And I'm going to venture a guess that all of us who are gathering today have had at least some moment in our lives when we've missed the mark. My guess is we've probably already had one so far today. We've all done something, said something, or thought something that fell short of God's standard for our lives. And if you're anything like me in those moments, sometimes you just start playing the sin comparison game. If you're not familiar with the sin comparison game, it goes a little bit like this. You'll say, hey, I know I should not have done fill in the blank. I shouldn't have lied. I shouldn't have cheated. I shouldn't have stolen that thing. I should not have eaten that 7th donut. But let me tell you about my brother-in-law. Right? He is really out of whack. And we start comparing ourselves to the people around us. And here's the problem with that. When God is looking at us, when God sees our sin, he's not comparing us to somebody else. He's not comparing us to our friend or to our brother-in-law. He's comparing us to himself. And the thing about God is he's perfect. He's holy. He's blameless. He's never sinned. And so we've got to understand this sin thing. It's not about us versus someone else. It's our sin against God's perfection. And maybe some of you are gathering today and you're like, listen, my friend invited me and he said this was a cool church. Like you don't talk about all that sin stuff all the time. And now here I am gathering and all we're doing is talking about sin. But I want to encourage you, stick with me. Because sin is not the end of our story. There's good news on the other side. But first we have to understand how this sin thing affects all of us. And so Paul continues here, and I'm going to tell you it'll get worse before it gets better. So we're getting to the solution. We're just not quite there yet. This is what Paul says. I have discovered this principle of life, that when I want to do what's right, I inevitably do what's wrong. But there's another power within me that is at war with my mind. And this power makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. He goes back to this sin thing. He goes back to blaming sin. And so I don't know if you've ever had a moment in your life where you felt trapped. Maybe you felt like you were in a fight that you just couldn't win. Maybe it was a physical fight, but it was probably a fight relationally or mentally or emotionally or maybe even spiritually. About 2 years ago, I started struggling with anxiety, which is something I never experienced before. And I know that anxiety can affect people differently, but for me, what would happen is that I would start to feel this tightening in my chest. And when I'd feel this tightening in my chest, it was an indication that I was overwhelmed and typically that I was trying to do too much. I was just trying to do too much, trying to be too much, trying to be in multiple places at one time, and it would just leave me feeling anxious. And in those moments, I had a choice to make. I was feeling anxious, and I could stop, I could breathe, I could pause, I could slow down, I could pray, or I could do what I would typically do, which is just do more. Try to manage it, try to figure it out, try to do it on my own, just thinking, hey, if I can just get this thing under control, I can figure it out. And I had this choice where I could run to God or I could run away from him. And on the surface, it didn't seem like sin, but underneath, that's what was going on. I was choosing my own way instead of God's way. And in those moments, I failed to realize the fight that I was in. And some of you are in that same place. You're trying, you're striving. You think if I just do that thing, if he just does that thing, if she just figures that out, and you fail to realize the fight that you're in. Because within all of us, within me, within you, there's a fight happening. There's a fight between good and evil. There's a fight between a God who loves us and is for us and an enemy of our faith who came to kill, steal, and destroy every good thing that God wants to bring into our lives. So we are in a fight, and if we don't understand the fight, we'll never understand how to get out of it. Because many of us are trying to do it on our own, but the truth is, this is a fight that we cannot win by ourselves. And some of you have tried it. So have I. If you've ever heard that phrase, where there's a will, there's a way, I think that's so often what we try to do in our lives. Our culture tells us that all the time. If there's a will, there's a way. Just like pick yourself up by your bootstraps, grin and bear it, work hard, figure it out, you can do it. And so we are trying to will our way into the life that we think that we want. But any of us who have tried that for any length of time know that in the end, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Because every day there are new problems, and every day there are circumstances we didn't think that we were going to face, and every day we get the diagnosis or the divorce papers or something new about COVID, and we realize we can't will our way into the life that we want to live. And so Paul knows this. And so he tells us here, hey, there is a solution to this fight. Here's what he says. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Guys, he is struggling here. This is not just like a lack of self-confidence. This sin thing is really tearing him up inside. He says, who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? And then he gives us the answer. He says, thank God, because the answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. It's not in us. He says, so you see how it is. In my mind, I really want to obey God's law, but because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin. So the bad news is we are in a fight, and it's a fight that we can't win on our own. But the good news is we have a way to win the fight, because culture is telling us this: where there's a will, there's a way. But God tells us this: where there's a willingness to rely on Jesus, then there is a way. But the way is not on our own. We are not the solution. And if we want to love God with all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our understanding, we have to stop relying on our will for our lives and start relying on His. It's a willingness thing. It's a willingness thing. And when we start to do that, everything changes. We've got to understand anything that we are doing in our life, even if it seems good on the surface, but it is disconnected from the God who knows us and loves us, will never last, because it's all about us. We are trying to do it on our own. And Paul is saying, that's a fight you're never going to win. The power of sin is too strong. My sin is too strong. My sin is overwhelming. It's not just about like making petty comments to my mom when I was 17 years old. This is something I face every day, because there's stuff inside of me that is sinful. Selfishness, pride, the times I'll make a side comment that I know is funny but is actually at the expense of another person. That's sin. Being obsessed with what other people think about me and wanting to gain affirmation from other people. Guys, that's sin, that's insecurity, and it is destroying our view of God. The power of sin in us is just too strong to conquer it on our own. And you've had these experiences. Maybe for you, it was something as simple as going on a diet for a few months. And you were like, I'm doing it. This is good. But then a bunch of your guy friends invite you out. And then you're like, well, okay, screw it. I'll eat that third cheeseburger. And then the next night, the same thing. And the next night, the same thing. And the next night, the same thing. If you've been married for more than 7 seconds, you've had a moment where you vowed to yourself, I will not fight with my spouse today. 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 But then they leave their dirty socks on the stairs, and you just can't help yourself, because they're not just socks. Those socks represent how he doesn't really care about anybody but himself, and he certainly doesn't care about you. And then all of a sudden, you are in this cycle over and over and over again, and you can't figure out how to break it. It's happened to all of us. We decide today, I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to study. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to quiet down. I'm going to speak up. I'm going to have faith. I'm going to keep going. And then inevitably, what happens? We find ourselves neglecting studying, quieting down instead of speaking up instead of quieting down, losing faith, quitting, and that's because we are in a cycle of sin that we cannot break on our own. Only Jesus, when we allow him into our lives, can we break this sin cycle, because we have fooled ourselves. We've told ourselves, culture has told us, that where there's a will, there's a way, but the truth is, where there's a willingness to rely on God, then there is a way. So what do we do with this? What now? How do we start by understanding really this sin thing, who God is, who Jesus is, how it affects us? And I think there are 3 simple things that we can do. They're not always easy, but they're simple. And the first thing is this, is we can practice a slot and a spot, a time and a place in our day for God. You hear us talk about this all the time around here, because I truly believe one of the best ways to understand God is to read the Bible, to read the Word of God, to understand more about who he is, what he wants for us, what he expects of us, the grace that he will show us. But we can't understand him if we never read about him. So make that commitment to be in your slot and spot, to pray, to read the Bible, to listen, to be closer to him. Did you know that? God doesn't want a bunch of stuff from you. He just wants you to be close to him. And that's one of the best ways that we can stay close to him. The second thing is we got to get real in a J group. We do something here called our J groups. They're small groups of people who get together to do something that they enjoy together. I've got a group I'm leading this summer of a bunch of people who are interested in learning a little bit more about communication. And so I love the time that we get to spend together. And as we've been reading through this Gospel of Mark a little bit earlier, there was a disciple, somebody in the crowd, who said to Jesus, hey, what's the greatest commandment? What's like the number one thing? If I don't do anything else, what's the number one thing? And Jesus responded, not with one thing, but with 2. He said the greatest commandment is love God and love others. So if we really want to understand who God is, how much he loves us, how we grow closer to him, we can't just be in a relationship with just him. There are things that he wants to do and will do in our lives, but he'll only do it through other people, because guys, that's how we were designed. Signing up for a J group does not help you better understand God, but going, being real, letting people in. Hey, if you've got real people in your life, your sin is not going to scare them away. In fact, it'll invite healing. It's going to invite freedom, but you've got to get real with other people. And then the last thing, and I think this is so big, is we've got to decide to stop deciding. One of the most powerful but practical things that we can do is to stop making 1,000 little decisions every day about who we want to be and what we're going to do. Because so many of us, I've had times like this in my life, where I'm waiting to feel something to make a decision, or I'm waiting for it to make practical sense. Guys, that's not faith, all right? Our choices have to lead, and then our feelings follow. Too many of us are trying to decide in the moment what we're going to do. I remember about a decade ago, I had just started following Jesus, and I was new to this whole like doing church thing like this and having a community. And I remember someone telling me, I was learning about tithing. This is something we read about in the Bible. Here we call it giving our first 10% back to what matters to God. And it really just is a simple exchange of trust. It's our way of saying to God, I trust you. And so I was growing in my faith, and so I wanted to give, but I didn't do it. All right, remember intention and action. I wanted to give, but I had $100,000 in student loan debt. I wanted to give, but I had just gotten married. I wanted to give, but I just had gotten a new job, and I wasn't really making that much money. And guess what? In that but was all of my fear. I wasn't living out of faith. I was living out of fear. And I'll never forget one day we were in a J group, and there was a woman who was talking about this giving thing. And she said that the first thing that she would do whenever she got her paycheck was that she would give first. She said, before I pay my bills, before I go grocery shopping, before I do anything else, I give first. And she said, I've always had enough. And that inspired me. I said, okay, I am done trying to decide every month whether or not I'm going to give, because spoiler alert, I got to the end of the month and there was never enough left over to give. And so I just made that decision. I set up reoccurring giving, and guys, I treated giving like a bill for years because I knew I can't change my heart until I change my habits. And let me tell you right now, where the months leading up to that, it felt like I never quite had enough. Once I made that decision and trusted God to do the thing he was asking me to do, I always, to this day, have had more than enough. Every single time. But I had to stop deciding every month if I was or if I wasn't. And there are some things right now that you are trying to decide every day that if you would just decide once and for all, it would change everything. You just decide, I am going to gather on a weekend. You just decide, I am going to lead that group. I am going to forgive. I am going to serve. I am going to give. I am going to lead. Stop trying to wait for your feelings to lead you. Start with your choices, and your feelings will follow. That's how God designed us. And so when there is a willingness to rely on Jesus, then there truly is a way. We are in a fight. I'm in a fight. You're in a fight. We are in this fight against sin. It wants to keep us trapped. It wants to keep us enslaved, but it isn't the end of our story, because when we understand who Jesus is, when we shift our perspective off of what's right in front of us, off of what we think we can control, and onto the God of the universe, we realize life is bigger than the here and now. And God has more for us than what he's had in the past. And the truth changes everything. Here's how Paul puts it in a different book of the Bible. He says, now, dear brothers and sisters, you can tell he loves the people he's writing to. He says one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. In other words, stop deciding every moment of every day who you're gonna be and who you're gonna follow and who's gonna be in charge of your life. And instead, just focus on what's true about you. Because here's what's true about you. You and I, we are broken. There is something called the power of sin that lives within us, that makes us want to do the wrong thing, the thing that can cause us to feel guilt or shame, and that's the bad news. But the good news is that we have a God who loved us enough that he would not just let us stay in the sin that separated us from him forever. That's the good news. We have a God who loved us enough to send his son, Jesus, to come to this earth, to experience what we've experienced, to feel what we felt, the shame, to feel rejection, fear, hurt, pain, suffering, and he felt it all. And then he went to a cross and he died a death, taking the weight of our sin on his shoulders. And he paid a price that we could never pay, because God loved us too much to just let us keep trying and trying and trying to get to him. And he said, hey, I'm gonna tip the fight in your favor. Did you know that's what Jesus is? Jesus is victory. Jesus is God's way of tipping the fight in our favor so that we don't have to live in this broken cycle every day. God already paid the price of our sin through his son, Jesus. That's what's true about us. That's the truth that you can focus on every single day, that you don't have to will your way into God's good graces anymore, because he's already done it for us. That's the truth. That is what is honorable and right and admirable and lovely and pure, because the truth is you don't have to keep doing it. You don't have to keep managing it. You don't have to keep chasing after perfection, because Jesus already did that for you. And so if you want to understand God, you've got to understand that you were created by a God who loves you. No matter what you've done or what you will do, he loves you. You were created by a God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. You were created by a God who tells us in his word that he sent his son Jesus so that we could have a rich and satisfying life. He came so that we could prosper. He tells us in his word, I've got a purpose for you. Not just your neighbor, you, every single one of you. I've got a purpose for you. I've got a plan for you, and that plan is good. That is the God who loves us. We don't have to stay stuck in our sin. We don't have to stay stuck in our shame. We just have to say, Jesus, I am willing to let you in to my life. So you just got to take a deep breath. You don't have to grin and bear it. You don't have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't have to will your way into another day. You just have to say, Jesus, you are leader and Lord of my life. You're leader and Lord over that relationship and that attitude and that addiction and that bad choice. You are leader and Lord of all of it. I'm not hanging on to it. It's yours. If you're here this weekend, you're gathering with us and you say, man, I needed that reminder because I've been trying to will my way into what I think I want out of life. And I needed to be reminded that I just have to have a willingness to let God work inside of me. Will you raise your hand? I want to pray over you and with you this weekend. God, we come to you surrendered. We come to you knowing we cannot do it on our own, manage it on our own, control it on our own, and God, we don't want to. In this moment, I pray that all of us would just open up our hands, that we would let go of the things that we've been trying to hold on to and instead say, God, I live not out of fear, but out of faith, out of submission, out of trust. And we pray that as we do that, God, that we see your blessings in our lives. And as we all just stay in this moment together, maybe you've heard me talking and you know you've never quite made that decision. Maybe you've been checking out this God thing or this church thing for a few months or years or even decades. But you know deep down, you're just trying to will this thing into existence on your own. And I want you to know, there's a God who loves you so much that you don't have to will your way to him anymore. All you have to do is say yes to letting Jesus be leader and Lord of your life. If you're gathering today and you've never made that decision, I want to invite you. I'm going to pray in a moment, and I want to invite you. Make this your moment. It will be the moment that everything changes, maybe not on the outside, but on the inside. And it's the start of the life that you've always wanted to live. So pray with me this morning. God, I come to you. I'm tired of living life on my own. I'm tired of trying and seeking and striving and managing. And in this moment, I make you, Jesus, leader and Lord of my life. I offer my whole life to you, and I trust you. And as we all just stay in this moment together, if you made that decision, We'd love for you to raise your hand. If you're watching online, you can just type faith in the comments. But if you made that decision to put your faith in Jesus, would you just raise your hand today? Yeah. You guys can put your hands down and journey. Won't you help me celebrate everyone turning towards Jesus today?